Welcome to the Green Room, where we discuss ways to green up our world. Last November, Ann Arbor City Council declared a climate emergency, which led to a unanimous vote to go carbon neutral, community-wide, by 2030, just 9.5 years from now. Here to talk to us about this ambitious goal is Dr. Missy Stults, Ann Arbor's Sustainability and Innovations Manager. Missy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's just start with the very basics. What is carbon neutrality?
Carbon neutrality basically means that the pollution that's causing climate change, we as an entire community are going to aim to get that pollution to zero here locally.
So that's a very ambitious goal. In the meantime, until we can reach that, is there such a thing as like buying offsets to help out?
Excellent question. So offsets will likely be part of the future for us. As you can imagine, you stated in your introduction, 9.5 years is not very far away. And true carbon neutrality community-wide, if we had no offsets, would mean no gas stations, no natural gas hookups. That's probably unrealistic. I think we all can recognize that in some way, shape, or form. And so offsets will likely have to be a bridge for us at some point. And we're going to start having a conversation about what we mean when we say offsets and what those look like.
Speaking of a conversation, I went to a really interesting presentation at the university by, I don't know if you heard about it, Professor Stolper and more. They were talking about university carbon neutrality, but they were talking about how an interesting idea that it doesn't matter where the greenhouse gases are reduced because it's all one atmosphere. And so they recommended buying offsets from communities where renewable energy is very efficiently produced, like say Arizona or something. And they were saying that we should buy offsets immediately. So kind of interesting concept.
Yeah, their work has actually come to the city, and we've been looking at it as well in the math. So both of them are doing really exceptional work. What they proposed mathematically was Tucson, if I remember right, was the community that they said would make a lot of sense. And they were looking at it from the university's perspective. We took that math, and what we've learned from our public engagement process around A20, our carbon neutrality strategy, is that while offsets are likely going to be part of the equation, not all offsets are created equal. So it's true, the atmosphere does not care where the reductions come from at all. And that's really, really important for a lot of the thinking that we're doing around A20. But we know that there are other co-benefits and co-values that the community holds. And so when we're thinking about offsets, one that we bring to the table is this idea of additionality. And what that basically means is actually the cheapest offset, or one of the cheapest offsets, is something like wind in Texas. But Texas already has a lot of wind on the grid. And so what we don't want to do is buy renewable energy that pushes renewable energy off the grid. Ideally, we want to invest in new renewable energies, so they're additional, that move coal or natural gas off the grid. So we might be paying a premium to do that in another place, but it seems like that's a pretty strong community value, not to move a renewable off the grid with more renewables, but displace the dirty, polluting fuels.
Very complex and a lot to think about.
It's fun.
So there's 6 different strategies that you've been working on coming up with, and we're going to go through each one one by one. And the first one is electrification. Do you want to address that?
Sure, and I just want to kind of frame that there are 6 overarching strategies, and there's a lot of sub-actions underneath those. So electrification is really a 2-pronged strategy. The idea here is that our appliances, our vehicles, those are the 2 kind of elements that are running on anything other than electric. We need to switch to electric. So think in your home, your furnace, your water heater, your stove. So how are we supporting people with electrifying those? And then, of course, the vehicles that we have, how are we moving towards electrification of our transit system?
So devil's advocate would say, if we're getting our energy from, say, DTE and they're using natural gas, how does that work?
So it'll get to the second one of our other strategies shortly, but right now today, if nothing changed and our grid looked the way our grid looked and you bought an electric vehicle, it's the equivalent of buying a car at a minimum of 50 miles per gallon. So for most people, you're still making a significant improvement, even plugging into the grid that we have today. But I have a sense we might be transitioning to strategy number 2, which helps address that issue.
Yes, clean and renewable energy.
Yeah, so the second overarching strategy is our electric grid has to be powered with 100% clean and renewable energy. And so the kinds of sub-actions that are a part of that include, actually a policy change is the biggest one, and the change that we're looking for is something called community choice aggregation. Basically what that means is it would give someone at the city, perhaps myself, the opportunity to go to market for everyone in Ann Arbor. So all of our electrical consumption for our residents, for our commercial enterprises, for the University of Michigan if they wanted to participate. And with that much demand, we would go to the market and say, we want new renewable energy built. We want it to displace fossil fuels. And perhaps we want it to be in low-income communities that are co-designing that project to be local economic job opportunities for those folks. And so if we did that, you could imagine we're getting a pretty darn good deal on electricity. So that is one strategy that we will be working on from a policy perspective, and then hopefully be able to actually go to market. And then there are sub-actions under there that include things like helping our residents and our businesses go solar locally, investing in community solar, which is legislation at the state level, which really is about helping people who maybe don't have a roof. They don't own their facility.
Well, I have a roof, but I have shaded
Yes,
roof.
for sure, right? We're Ann Arbor, right? We love our trees, it's beautiful. So not every place is viable for solar. And what community solar allows us to do is to build a community asset, a solar field somewhere that we all buy a little bit into, and we all own that little bit that we contribute towards. So that is also legislation that is right now at the House or at the state level, and so we're interested in seeing that move forward.
Powering Michigan Forward, is
That's
that
right,
it?
thank you. It's a package of bills.
So nuclear, a lot of people say that that's a clean energy and we should be moving towards nuclear. Do you think that could be part of the mix?
We have a strong sense there is no appetite locally for nuclear to be part of the mix. It is part of our electric grid right now, as people probably know, because it's part of DTE's portfolio of energy. Really, when we're talking about renewable energy, we're sort of thinking effectively about three options. We're thinking about solar, geothermal, and then wind. And wind wouldn't be local. We've done studies. We don't actually have pretty high viability for local wind, but that might be somewhere else that we're investing in wind.
So the next overarching strategy is energy efficiency, and I think that one's pretty self-evident, but one thing I'm hoping you'll touch on is in rental housing.
Yeah. So energy efficiency, honestly, it's sort of like the peas and the carrots of a lot of this work. We've been working in energy efficiency. For anyone who has done anything in the environmental field, you know that's sort of one of the most basic things that we talk about. And it is not particularly alluring to a lot of people. And so we have to do quite a lot of work to make that part of the package in the portfolio, because we know the cheapest form of energy is the energy you never use. So we're thinking about how to kind of frame that. There's a bunch of sub-actions under there. But to your question, in the rental space, there's a few ways to kind of cut this one. One is we have a lot of partners that are part of A20 helping us really think about this. And the Washtenaw Area Apartment Association is one of those partners. They are our landlords, and they're helping us think about what they need to actually make those investments. Is it access to vendors who can do the work? Is it low interest loans? Is it access to the rebates that our utilities may provide? So that's part of it, getting the information and the tools really accessible to the folks that own these properties or manage these properties. And then the second is we have a program that we're hoping to launch called the Green Rental Efficiency Program. And there's only one other community in the US that has this. It's Boulder, Colorado. And so we're looking to work with our community to actually create a standard, a baseline, kind of a floor that says if you're going to rent in Ann Arbor, you got to have this kind of efficiency.
Vehicle miles traveled, reducing that.
Right, so I think we're at the fourth. The fourth overarching strategy is reducing the vehicle miles we travel in our cars by 50%. And this really is composed of three sub-actions. One is making sure that we have better public transit, more expansive public transit. So it's making sure you don't have to wait very long for a ride and that you can get to where you want to go in an efficient and timely manner.
Yeah,
so
I
that's
have a neighbor that can't drive, and she usually works a night shift, and she told me that there's very few jobs she can get that because the buses don't run very much in the weekends at night, that kind of thing. So she's really limited at what she can take.
Well, there are times that I'll come out of a city council meeting and there is no public transit option because the buses aren't running at that time. And so I'm left stranded, and I think about this from a civic standpoint, if you can't get to city council and staff can't get home using public transit, that's also a really big problem. So it actually ricochets through a lot of our system.
And it's kind of a justice issue too, because you're young and healthy, and if you're not, which is a whole lot of people in our society, the buses don't work for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So really investing in our transit system, including regional transit. We are an economic hub, and so getting people here safely and efficiently is really important. So that's kind of sub-action 1 in the vehicle miles traveled. The second is making sure we have ubiquitous biking and walking infrastructure. So sidewalks should be everywhere. We should have protected bike lanes so people feel safe biking on our roads. And then the third kind of ties into that. Just because you have a sidewalk doesn't mean it leads you anywhere you want to go. And so it's really a land use suite of actions. And those focus on making sure that we have accoutrements in our neighborhoods. You know, if you want to go get a gallon of milk, you shouldn't have to get in a car and drive 4 miles to Kroger's to do that. Can you walk down the street or take your bike somewhere to get it? If you want to have a night out, is there somewhere locally that you could walk to and do that? Those are really important elements. And then the other one is, Ann Arborites have a lower carbon footprint than people in the surrounding area. And as you very rightly pointed out, the atmosphere doesn't care where reductions come from. And so we need to really densify our community and make sure that people can be here, because when we build that infrastructure, those are all individuals that don't have to drive all of the places they want to go. And so we've just significantly reduced emissions as well.
Back to the sidewalks, and my friend who's a neighbor, she said that there's a lot of places that she wants to go. She gets out of the bus, and then there's no sidewalks to safely walk the rest of the way. And I thought about that with places that I want to go. There's, the bus stop. Yeah, there's a lot of buses, but I can't walk over the freeway to get to the rest of the ways. And back to the density issue, would that include perhaps with the single-family zoning allowing more, like duplexes or accessory dwelling units, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so one of the strategies we looked at was by right allowing in our residential districts duplexes, triplexes in that space. So we're not talking about having a 10-story building next to your house, but having a duplex next to your house is a way to densify and still maintain that character of that neighborhood. And then there are other areas where it makes sense to have a 10-story building if that is what is needed and desired and the market can bear. Something like a downtown can probably handle that, or certain transit corridors might be able to handle that kind of development.
And another interesting thing I noticed was sliding parking fees. Can you address that?
Yep, so one of the important elements is if you build the infrastructure, some people will take it because it's available, being public transit or walking and biking. That's sort of the carrot approach. And then there's the other side, the stick approach, which sends a market signal to really raise parking rates where we need to. And this is the thing I know that probably causes the most heartburn actually for people when they see that, but we actually have fairly affordable parking rates, and it's not sending a signal not to drive downtown. So it's not enough to raise the parking rates, because that is an equity issue without everything else behind it. Right, so the strategy is, how do you build the public transit that's frequent and accessible and viable, and then you start raising the rates to push people to actually take the mode of transit that is beneficial.
Well, it works for me because I don't live very far from town, and if I had free parking and it was very easy to get and I didn't have to fight and drive all around, I would probably do it when I was in a hurry, but now it's faster for me to walk or ride my bike.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's why I do it so much.
Great.
Well, of course, it's good for my health.
I mean, I
good
know
for the climate.
That's why you really are doing it. I know. The other are just ancillary.
It does make a difference, I tell you. Okay, so the fifth one is solid waste. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so it's actually changing our relationship with the materials we use, reuse, and eventually dispose of. And so this is both what I'll call downstream and upstream. So downstream, after we've gotten these materials, we've already chosen to purchase this or the book on the table. What do we do when we're done with it? So thinking about reuse and really kind of reinvigorating our reuse centers and making them cool again and hip again, which for a large portion of the population, they've been pretty cool for a long time, but making that kind of part of our culture. I think about the lending library concept. They're all over town. How do we do that with other things? How do we maybe share tools, having a community tool shed? Because As much as my husband wanted a miter saw, we don't use a miter saw very frequently, and I imagine the community could probably handle one for our whole neighborhood in that space. So how are we having a more sharing economy? We have to invest pretty significantly in getting to year-round composting. Methane emissions are produced from our food waste, and if we can, when they're disposed of in the landfill, absence of oxygen, and so if we can properly dispose of that food waste, that has a pretty notable impact. Recycling is important. And then that's the downstream. And then going upstream, it's really questioning what we buy, how we buy, when we buy. So everything from the Amazon effect, it's really convenient to just click a button and get what you want today. Couldn't we do something where the community packages and maybe Amazon delivers only one day in a neighborhood? And so everyone gets it. And that reduces a lot of trips. And so there'll be times where there's urgent things, but maybe that could work. And then think about the community element that's being nurtured in that space. So there's some co-benefits that we're working through.
Yeah, I was wondering with solid waste how that relates to climate. You mentioned the methane, but I was also thinking about if we're buying a lot of stuff and it's manufactured with companies that are using fossil fuels, it's like an embedded energy use.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And emissions vary significantly. There's calculations really trying to understand what upstream emissions look like. Calculations are everywhere from 17% to 40% of emissions might actually be those embedded emissions you're talking about.
And refrigerant recycling, I noticed you mentioned that at one point, and you also mentioned this book, I think, right?
I did.
Yeah, Drawdown, and the number one strategy, they rank, I don't know how many, but 100. And the number one was recycling refrigerants,
right?
HFCs. Do you want to address that?
Sure. So refrigerants are not something we often think about. They're in your refrigerator, your freezer, and your coolants. They're coolants, so they're in your air conditioner. Refrigerants are extremely potent greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide is what we talk about most frequently, and that has a global warming potential of 1. So everything is measured against that in the atmosphere. Methane, much more potent, but refrigerants are up to 6,000 to 9,000 times more of a warmer than carbon dioxide. So just a little bit has an enormous impact in terms of global climate change. So basically what we need to do is make sure that we don't inadvertently release those into the atmosphere, because it can very quickly negate all of the other good work that we did. So we have to continue to be really intentional and purposeful in recycling those.
Now, the last one is, I wanted to mention food waste, because that's so important. I heard that the production of food waste is the big, that's kind of upstream, and then the food miles is only 11%. So the waste of food is really a huge thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you could imagine, while we have to get compost for the food that we do waste, if you had accessibility to local markets or things you could walk to, it would be easier than having to go to the grocery store once a week and buy everything in a package. And so you might be able to say, tonight we want X, and pick it up on the way home, because you're literally walking by a local produce market as you get off your bus to come home. So, all of those things are really, really important behavior changes.
So you wouldn't waste so much because you're not buying so much and shoving it in your fridge and losing
find it in the back. And you're like, oh, what am I going to do with those carrots?
Methanes.
Exactly.
All right, so the last one is resilience, and I noticed that you have a doctorate in urban resilience to climate change, so you're very well prepared to discuss this one. What is resilience?
So resilience, to me, we think about not just surviving, we think about thriving. And so the 6th kind of overarching strategy is about increasing the resilience of our people and our place. So of course our ecosystem and our relationship to that ecosystem, but also you as a person and your neighborhood and the people that you know and love. People take care of people. People bond with people. We're inherently social creatures. So how are we investing in that element, which is really hard to quantify, but priceless in terms of the impact it has on our quality of life?
And the mission is to have a just transition to carbon neutrality. What is just transition?
So the element that we're getting at there is that it is possible to go through this entire endeavor and not ever put equity front and center in that discussion. And we think, as the Office of Sustainability and Innovations, that that would be a grave mistake. that climate change is perpetuated not by our poor minority populations primarily, but by the affluent countries, individuals, et cetera. We're the ones that are consuming the most. And I will personally take that on, right? I consume more than the average human being globally does. And so there is a disproportionate burden that I should bear in terms of reducing my footprint. So we could go through an entire process that doesn't talk about equity, and what would end up happening is we would perpetuate inequality in our system. And so we are trying to be very purposeful and intentional in thinking about not just who's impacted and how they're impacted, but what strategies actually help address inequalities in our system.
One thing related to that is the more housing we have, I hear the more affordable the housing becomes because you're not, fighting over a few units, and also the more walkable our housing is, the less reliance on cars, and that cars are, very expensive. So those are the main overarching goals. So how does that differ from the climate action plan that was put together in 2012?
Yeah, the climate action plan in 2012 was really striving to achieve goals that Council had set, focusing on an 8% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2015, and then a 25% reduction by 2025, and then the long-term goal was a 90% reduction by 2050. So we basically have just put that on a fast track and moved it much, much more quickly. So we definitely have drawn from that action plan. We've learned a lot. Many things have happened, and other things are just not at the scale necessary to achieve our goals. So we've either had to really beef them up, or we've had to jettison them and replace them with other things.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting was maybe doing a carbon tax locally. What would that look like?
So the carbon tax is actually only for local government operations, so for the municipal government itself. We've been working with students, actually Sam Stoppel's students at the University of Michigan on this project, to figure out how do we send a signal internally that there are costs that aren't dollars and cents costs associated with the choices that we have. Emitting carbon into the environment has a social cost. There's a social cost on carbon. And so we wanted to see, could we actually create an internal carbon, a price on carbon, and then put it through all the different departments, and would that generate a signal to change behavior? And so we went through a process. We worked with the finance department, and we decided we were going to try. So we are starting very, very low in the cost per ton. We're doing, the proposed is a $5 per ton cost, and the idea is that it would increase every year to get to an actual market price that's comparable with what we think the true cost of carbon is in the market. So in the first year, if it goes through and every department was charged based on their energy usage and their vehicle miles traveled, et cetera, it would only impact the city's budget by $150,000. So it's pretty small in a $440 million operation. But that's not the point, right? The point is to start getting people to think differently.
I can't help but wonder about a federal carbon tax, how it would make everything so much easier at the local level.
There are a lot of things the federal government could do to make life a little bit easier.
And the state level too, like building codes.
Correct, yeah.
Because right now we're not allowed to beef up our building codes.
We are not allowed to go above the state's building code in Michigan. So there is movement, and there's a group of organizations, and the city is certainly interested in that and trying to get the state to leapfrog building codes. Likely we'll be voting on a new building code in 2021, and we would like it to be the newest code that's possible. We're a few years behind in codes, so instead of just kind of going through the system and going backwards, we want to leapfrog and become pretty modern as a state. And that actually, if that were to happen, that is one of the actions that are in our, that will likely be in our strategy, that will help us actually set net zero energy targets for buildings, because that's one of the things in the new code that's being circulated.
Great.
Yeah.
So some people might say that why should we do this if all the other cities aren't going to do it too?
A few angles. One, our partners in this initiative also include Washtenaw County, the city of Ypsilanti. We're working with Pittsfield Township on a number of initiatives. So they're already at the table, and we are sharing and learning back and forth, because regionally we do have to be all kind of working together on this. Second, we work with municipalities throughout the state and throughout the country and throughout the world. We're highly networked, municipalities are. And so we steal profusely. It's the highest form of a compliment, taking what someone else has done. We learn from each other, and I think we all acknowledge that when one of us succeeds, we're all succeeding. And so there is this shared camaraderie. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of local governments just domestically working on this issue. So we're not an island in and of ourselves. And third, I'd say we have privilege in Ann Arbor. We have wealth, we have knowledge, and it is unequivocally beholden on us to use that to figure out how to do this and to help others do this as well. So I think there's a moral call for us to be acting as well.
And we're out of time today, so thank you so much for being here, Missy. It's been really great. And thank you so much for all the great work you do.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
So for this show and all our Green Room shows, go to washtenaw.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.